This is a boring history video made for sleep. You don't need to listen closely. You don't need to remember anything. There will be no loud sounds. No dramatic moments. No surprises. This video will continue slowly and quietly until the very end. Even if you fall asleep halfway through, that is completely fine. If falling asleep to slow stories like this feels comfortable to you, there are many more that sound the same on this channel. Tonight may not be the last time. Tonight, we will simply spend some time in a quiet moment from the past. Nothing important is going to happen. Just let the words fade into the background. And now, we begin. Did you know that many medieval castles weren't just built to keep enemies out, but were designed as massive, stone puzzles, where every single block was carved to fit only one specific spot? In this story, we will follow the birth of a fortress through the lens of a single, monumental day of labor. You will see the sweat of the quarrymen, the precision of the master masons, and the sheer architectural defiance required to turn a jagged hilltop into a symbol of eternal power. The sun had not yet crested the horizon, but the summit of the Wolf's Crag was already alive with the rhythmic clinking of iron against stone. This was the site where a new legacy was being etched into the earth, a fortification intended to command the valley for centuries. To the casual observer, it appeared as a chaotic scar of mud and jagged rock, but to the master builder, it was a living blueprint. The air was thick with the scent of damp pine and pulverized limestone. Below, the mist clung to the river like a shroud, hiding the slow-moving ox carts that would soon begin their grueling ascent. Every great castle began not with a wall, but with the earth itself. The laborers spent these early hours clearing the overburden, the layers of soil and loose debris that hid the bedrock. A castle was only as strong as the stone it sat upon. To build on soft earth was to invite the slow, crushing embrace of gravity. The workers used wooden shovels tipped with iron to scrape away the history of the forest, exposing the gray, ancient spine of the mountain. This was the foundation, the silent partner in every siege to come. As the morning light grew sharper, the quarrymen intensified their assault on the nearby limestone vein. This was the castle's primary source of life. They didn't use explosives or massive machinery, they used the fundamental laws of physics. Steel wedges were driven into natural fissures in the rock. With heavy wooden mallets, the men struck the wedges in a synchronized rhythm, a heartbeat of construction that echoed across the valley. Once the cracks widened, they inserted dry wooden pegs and soaked them with water. As the wood expanded with agonizing slowness, it exerted a silent, irresistible force that snapped the massive slabs of stone clean from the mountain's grip. The raw blocks, some weighing as much as a small carriage, were then hauled toward the dressing area. Here, the rough cutters took over. Their job was to strip away the excess of nature. With heavy picks, they squared the stones, turning jagged boulders into manageable rectangles. The ground was soon covered in a thick carpet of white dust, turning the workers into ghostly figures. Every strike was calculated. A single misplaced blow could shatter a stone that had taken hours to extract. The stone was hard, but in the hands of those who understood its grain, it was as malleable as clay. By the time the sun fully cleared the trees, the site was a beehive of specialized labor. The master mason moved between the foundation trenches, his long wooden staff marking the precise corners where the great towers would rise. He checked the depth of the ditches, ensuring they reached the living rock. Any pocket of clay or loose sand was excavated and replaced with packed rubble. The castle was being anchored to the very core of the world. In the center of the site, a large wooden crane, a treadwheel, stood like a skeletal giant. It was a marvel of medieval engineering, powered by men walking inside a massive wheel to hoist the heaviest loads. Today, it would lift the first foundation stones, the massive blocks that would bear the weight of the entire keep. The air grew warmer, and the smell of wood smoke rose from the blacksmith's forge. The smith was perhaps the most vital man on the site. Without him, the work would grind to a halt. The limestone was so abrasive that it dulled the steel chisels within minutes. The clink 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 of the masonry was punctuated by the clang clang of the forge as the smith hammered the tools back into sharpness, quenching them in barrels of dark water that hissed with steam. The cycle was endless. The earth gave up its stone, the fire sharpened the steel, and the human hand brought them together to create something that would outlast the very names of the men building it. The first layer of the curtain wall was beginning to take shape. This was the plinth, the sloping base designed to deflect stones dropped from above and to prevent rams from gaining a foothold. Each block was bedded into a thick layer of lime mortar, a mixture of burnt limestone, sand, and water that took weeks to cure but centuries to fail. The masons worked with a quiet, intense focus. They weren't just building a wall, they were weaving a barrier. Between the two outer faces of finished stone, the hearting was poured, a mix of rough rocks and liquid mortar that would harden into a monolithic core, turning the wall into a single, unbreakable artificial cliff. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the dusty plateau, the focus shifted from raw extraction to the delicate artistry of the Freemasons. These were the elite craftsmen, named for their ability to work with freestone, a fine-grained limestone or sandstone that could be carved with intricate precision. While the rough cutters dealt in bulk and brawn, the Freemasons worked in a secluded area shielded by canvas awnings to keep the direct glare of the sun from distorting their vision. Their task for the morning was the most complex puzzle of the castle, the stones for the great spiral staircase of the North Tower. Each step, or vane, was carved from a single massive block. It was an architectural feat that required the stone to serve two purposes simultaneously. The thick, rounded end of the step would stack perfectly atop the one below it to form the newel, the central supporting pillar of the staircase. Meanwhile, the wide, flat tail of the stone would be embedded into the outer circular wall. To achieve this, the masons used zinc or wooden templates, tracing the exact curves onto the stone with silver points. There was no room for error. If a single step was a fraction of an inch too high or its angle slightly off, the entire spiral would gradually drift, eventually causing the staircase to jam or collapse before it reached the second floor. The sound in this part of the site was different, a softer, more melodic tink-tink of light mallets hitting fine chisels. The air here was saturated with a powder so fine it coated the masons' eyelashes and beards in a white frost. They worked with straight edges and squares, constantly checking the flatness of the surfaces. A finished step was as smooth as polished bone. These men were the mathematicians of the dirt, translating the master builder's abstract visions into a physical reality that would guide the footsteps of knights and servants for half a millennium. Near the center of the construction site, a new sound began to dominate the atmosphere, the heavy, rhythmic thud of ox hooves and the groaning of ungreased axles. The first timber shipments were arriving from the deep forests in the valley. While the castle was a shell of stone, its internal skeletal system was made of oak. Massive logs, some over 30 feet long and as thick as a man's chest, were being hauled up the winding path. These were destined to become the corbels and the primary floor joists for the great hall. The carpenters took charge of the timber the moment it was unloaded. Using broadaxes and adzes, they began squaring the logs. They didn't use saws for the heavy shaping. Instead, they used the natural grain of the wood. A skilled carpenter could swing a heavy axe and shave a sliver of wood as thin as parchment, turning a round tree trunk into a perfectly rectangular beam. These beams were then notched with mortise and tenon joints. No iron nails were used for the primary structure. Instead, they used trunnels, tree nails made of dried oak that would swell when exposed to the moisture in the air, locking the joints together with a grip that grew tighter over time. By mid-morning, the synergy between stone and wood became apparent. The masons were now carving sockets directly into the rising stone walls. These gaps were designed to receive the ends of the oak beams. It was a delicate dance of timing. The walls had to be high enough to support the floors, but the beams had to be set in place before the next courses of stone were laid, effectively locking the wood into the masonry. This integration ensured that the floors acted as internal bracing, preventing the massive stone walls from bowing outward under their own immense weight. The heat of the day began to radiate from the white limestone, shimmering in the air. The water carriers, often young boys, ran back and forth between the well and the workers, lugging heavy ceramic jugs. Every man on the ridge knew that the success of the day depended on the setting of the mortar. If the sun was too hot, the mortar would dry too quickly and crack; if it rained, it would wash away. To protect the morning's work, laborers began soaking straw mats in water and draping them over the fresh wall heads. This slowed the evaporation, allowing the lime to breathe and chemically bond with the stone, turning the separate blocks into a singular, artificial mountain. The sun had reached its zenith, and the heat over the Wolf's Rock had become almost palpable. It was at this moment, when the shadows were at their shortest, that the most dangerous work of the day began, the erection of the external scaffolding and the launching of the great crane stepper. Without these wooden structures, the castle would forever remain only a low foundation, for human strength has its limits, and stone knows no mercy. The master carpenters, true acrobats of medieval construction, began to fasten vertical poles of flexible willow and strong oak. They did not drive piles into the ground, because there was solid rock underfoot. Instead, they used fingers, short wooden beams that were inserted into specially left holes in the stonework of the wall itself. On these beams was laid a flooring of rods tied together with hemp ropes. Each knot was a matter of life and death. The scaffolding encircled the tower like a spider's web, growing with the castle. It was not rigid; it had to sway slightly in the wind so as not to break under the weight of people and materials. In the center of the site, a wooden giant came to life, a treadwheel crane. It was a massive structure resembling a huge squirrel wheel, built of the best ash and oak wood. 2 men entered the wheel. They began to walk, endlessly stepping up the inner rungs, and under their weight the wheel began to slowly rotate. Ropes as thick as a man's arm, greased with tallow for better sliding, tightened. With a sound like the groan of a large animal, the first massive block for the window arm broke away from the ground. It was a moment of the highest tension. Upstairs, on the narrow deck of the scaffolding, the stackers were waiting for the load. They had no safety net, only their own sense of balance and faith in the strength of the ropes. The stone, weighing half a ton, slowly rose past them. The slightest gust of wind could turn this load into a destructive pendulum core. When the stone reached the required height, the master builder gave a signal with his hand. The men in the wheel froze, holding the weight only with the strength of their muscles. Now the crowbars came into play. The stackers carefully pushed the stone, directing it onto the prepared bed of liquid mortar. It was a job of surgical precision. The stone had to sit exactly the first time. If the mortar squeezed out unevenly, the block had to be lifted again, which exhausted both men and equipment. When the block was finally in place, one of the masons tapped it with a wooden mallet, checking the sound. A dull, confident response meant that there were no air pockets between the stone and the base. While the crane was running, another crucial task continued on the ground, the lime making. The white mass boiled in large pits. The quicklime was mixed with water, and the chemical reaction was so violent that the mixture could burn to the bone. Sharp river sand was added to it, and sometimes, according to the ancient secrets of the craftsman, horsehair for reinforcement, or even raw eggs and bull's blood, to make the solution stronger than the stone itself when it set. This smell, sharp, alkaline, mixed with the smell of sweat and fresh wood, became the very breath of the newborn castle. By midday, the walls rose higher than a man's height. The castle was no longer a mere drawing on the ground; it began to cast its own shadow, blocking the sun from those who worked at its foot. Each stone laid added thousands of pounds of pressure to the rows below, testing the foundation laid at dawn. The building began to sit down, finding its place in the history of the rock. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, the atmosphere on the ridge shifted from the airy heights of the scaffolding to the sweltering intensity of the blacksmith's yard. The castle was not merely a construction of stone and wood, it was held together by the strength of forged iron. The smelter's corner was a blackened patch of earth where the heat was so fierce it distorted the air. Here, the smiths were busy crafting cramps, large, U-shaped iron staples designed to bind the massive cornerstones of the keep together. In areas where the pressure of the earth or the structural thrust of a high vault was greatest, mortar alone was not enough. The masons carved narrow channels into the tops of two adjacent stones. The blacksmith would then forge an iron bar, glowing cherry red, and hammer it into these grooves. To prevent the iron from rusting and expanding, which could split the stone from the inside, molten lead was poured over the iron. The acrid smoke of the lead melting pot mingled with the charcoal fumes, creating a heavy, metallic haze that clung to the laborer's skin. This was the invisible skeleton of the fortress, ensuring that even the vibrations of a catapult strike would not shake the blocks from their alignment. Meanwhile, at the base of the rising east tower, the master mason was supervising the most critical architectural feat of the day, the setting of the first internal arch. An arch is a miracle of physics, a way to create an opening in a wall that supports thousands of tons of weight above it. To build it, the carpenters first had to construct a centering, a massive wooden semicircle that acted as a temporary rib. This timber frame was wedged into place with extreme care. If it shifted by even a hair's breadth, the arch would be lopsided, a fatal flaw that would haunt the building for centuries. The masons began placing the voussoirs, the wedge-shaped stones that form the curve of the arch. Unlike the square blocks of the curtain wall, each voussoir had to be cut at a precise angle so that the pressure from above would be distributed sideways and downward into the vertical piers. The work proceeded from both sides simultaneously, moving upward toward the center. The men worked in silence, the only sound being the scrape of stone on stone and the occasional grunt of effort. They were building toward the keystone, the final, central block that would lock the entire structure into a state of permanent tension. The climax of the hour arrived when the keystone was hoisted into the air. It was larger and heavier than the other blocks, often decorated with a simple carved cross or the Lord's heraldry. As the crane lowered it into the gap at the apex of the wooden centering, a hush fell over the nearby workers. The stone was greased with a thin layer of fine mortar and driven home with a heavy mallet. The thump of the final blow signaled that the geometry was complete. Though the wooden frame still supported it for now, the arch was technically alive, ready to carry the weight of the heavens. Behind the masons, the laborers of the pile, continued the grueling task of filling the core of the walls. While the masters focused on the arches and faces, these men dumped baskets of spalls, the jagged waste chips from the stone cutting, into the hollow center between the ashlar faces. They then poured in buckets of hot lime grout. This liquid masonry seeped into every crevice, surrounding the rubble and hardening into a substance as tough as the original mountain. This sandwich construction was the secret to the medieval castle's durability. The outer stone provided the skin, but the rubble and lime core provided the invincible heart. As the afternoon light began to golden, casting long, dramatic shadows across the inner ward, the focus shifted to the loopholes, the narrow, vertical apertures that would serve as the castle's primary defensive eyes. These were not mere holes in the wall, they were masterpieces of defensive engineering. While the lower courses of the curtain wall were thick and blunt, the stones surrounding the arrow slits had to be carved with a sophistication that combined the skills of a sculptor with the strategy of a general. The oilet cutters worked with specialized, long-necked chisels. Their task was to create an opening that was incredibly narrow on the outside, barely 2 inches wide, to prevent enemy arrows from entering, but which flared dramatically on the inside. This embrasure allowed an archer within the castle a wide field of vision and plenty of room to maneuver their bow. The interior stones had to be cut into smooth, sloping cheeks. If the angle was too sharp, the archer's view would be restricted; if it was too shallow, the wall would be weakened. Every stone in the aperture was a custom-fitted piece of a lethal puzzle. The master mason walked along the inner line, checking the splay of the stones with a wooden gauge. He looked for the throat of the loop, the narrowest point where the stone was most vulnerable. To reinforce these points, the masons used ashlar dressings, made of the hardest sandstone available, capable of shattering an incoming bolt without splintering. The precision required here was a stark contrast to the brute force of the rubble fillers. Here, the stone had to be as sharp and exact as a blade. While the masons worked on the stone eyes, a different group of specialists arrived at the base of the keep, the glass masters, and their apprentices. In this early stage of construction, glass was an extreme luxury, reserved only for the chapel or the lord's private solar. For the rest of the castle, windows were actually wind eyes, openings to the elements. However, for the privileged spaces, the masters brought small, precious panes of forest glass, which had a greenish tint from the potash used in its creation. They didn't set the glass directly into the stone. Instead, they worked with the blacksmiths to create iron armatures, grids of bars that would hold the small diamond-shaped panes in place with strips of lead. This was a delicate operation amidst the heavy dust of the construction site. The glass workers set up a temporary screen of dampened hides to create a clean zone, where they could solder the lead cames without the wind blowing out their small charcoal braziers. It was a moment of fragile beauty appearing within a landscape of raw, gray power. By now, the castle's verticality was becoming intimidating. The higher the walls rose, the more the wind load became a factor. Even on a relatively calm day, the gusts at the top of the ridge were significantly stronger than at the base. The laborers on the scaffolding felt the structure hum under their feet. To counter the pressure, the masons began installing putlog reinforcements, horizontal timbers that remained embedded deep within the wall even after the scaffolding was removed, acting like internal tendons. The sun was now low enough that it began to shine directly through the newly finished arrow slits, sending long, thin spears of light across the muddy interior of the ward. These beams of light revealed the true scale of the day's progress. The castle was no longer a plan, it was a physical force that had begun to dictate how the light fell and how the wind blew. The Wolf's Crag had been permanently altered, its natural jaggedness now harnessed into the disciplined, lethal geometry of the High Middle Ages. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and deep orange, the work turned to a less glamorous but equally vital aspect of the fortress, the garderobes. A castle was a machine for living as much as it was a machine for war, and without a sophisticated waste management system, the thickest walls would eventually succumb to disease and decay. These stone latrines were being built directly into the thickness of the outer curtain walls, requiring a complex internal design that the masons called the secret plumbing. The garderobe was essentially a small stone chamber cantilevered out over the steepest part of the cliff. The masons carved the chutes, long, vertical shafts that dropped waist down the face of the rock, far away from the castle's foundations. To build these, the masons had to ensure the internal surfaces of the stones were polished to a mirror-like smoothness. Any protrusion or rough edge could cause a blockage, which would be nearly impossible to clear once the wall rose another 30 feet. They used a slurry of fine lime and vinegar to coat the interior of the shaft, creating a slick, water-resistant lining that would withstand the corrosive effects of time and waste. The engineering of the chute was a study in strategic vulnerability. If the shaft was too large, an adventurous enemy might attempt to climb up it during a siege. To prevent this, the masons installed baffle stones, internal projections that turned the straight drop into a zigzag. This allowed gravity to do its work while making it impossible for a human body to navigate the passage from the bottom. These shafts were the silent veins of the castle, hidden behind several feet of solid ashlar, proving that even the most mundane human needs required the highest level of architectural foresight. Simultaneously, on the ground level, the water drawers were finalizing the lining of the great well. This was the most grueling task of the day. While the towers rose toward the heavens, a team of miners had spent the daylight hours descending into the dark bowels of the ridge. They were chiseling through the solid bedrock to reach the water table. The walls of the well were being steined, lined with curved, interlocking stones that prevented the earth from collapsing inward. The precision here was paramount. Because the well would be submerged in water, the mortar used was a special, hydraulic mix, often containing crushed volcanic ash or brick dust, which allowed it to set underwater. Every stone was hammered into place with a heavy mallet until it rang with the same pitch as the stones around it. The well was the castle's lifeblood. A fortress could survive a year without food, but not a week without the cold, clear water rising from the depths of the mountain. As the light failed, the plum masters made their final rounds. They hung their lead weights against the rising walls one last time. In the cooling air, the stone began to contract slightly, a process known as the settling of the soul. If the walls were out of alignment by even a fraction of a degree, the weight of the upper floors would eventually cause the base to spall or explode outward. The masters walked in silence, feeling the stones with their calloused hands, listening for the subtle groans of a building that was becoming a part of the landscape. The air was now cooling rapidly, and the smell of roasting salt pork began to drift from the laborers' camp. The day's heavy labor was drawing to a close, but the castle was now a looming presence. The skeleton of the great hall, the jagged teeth of the battlements, and the deep, dark eyes of the garderobe chutes all stood as a testament to a day where mountain had been transformed into monument. The transition from day to dusk brought a different kind of craftsmen to the summit, the plumbers or leadsmiths. While the masons and laborers were beginning to pack their tools, these men were preparing the castle's first defense against the most relentless enemy of all, water. The gatehouse turrets, now standing proud at their intermediate height, required a temporary cap to protect the fresh masonry and provide a platform for the next day's work. In the medieval world, lead was the silver mantle that made a fortress watertight. In a clearing away from the main dust of the stone cutters, the lead smiths had established their casting beds. These were flat troughs filled with damp, compacted sand, leveled with a precision that rivaled the master mason's squares. Ingots of raw lead, heavy and dull gray, were melted in large iron cauldrons over a roaring fire of charcoal and bellows-fed air. The molten metal shimmered with a deceptive, liquid brilliance, like a pool of moonlight. Once the dross was skimmed from the surface, the smiths used long-handled ladles to pour the liquid metal onto the sand beds. They worked with a practiced, rhythmic speed, using a wooden strike to spread the molten lead into thin, even sheets. As the metal cooled, it turned from a fluid silver to a soft, malleable gray. These sheets were then rolled and hauled up the scaffolding to the top of the gatehouse turrets. Unlike stone, lead was living. It expanded in the heat and contracted in the cold. To accommodate this movement, the smiths didn't nail the sheets down rigidly. Instead, they used seams and rolls, folding the edges of the sheets over each other so they could slide and breathe without ever letting a drop of rain reach the timber rafters below. On the roof's edge, the gutter carvers were finishing their work on the first gargoyles. These were not merely decorative monsters, they were functional plumbing. Each gargoyle was a long, channeled stone that projected far out from the wall. The lead sheets of the roof were tucked into these stone channels, ensuring that rainwater would be thrown clear of the castle walls rather than trickling down and eroding the lime mortar. A mason spent the final hour of light chiseling the grotesque face of a screaming hound into the end of a spout, turning a drainage pipe into a guardian of the heights. The installation of the wall plate, the massive oak beam that sat atop the stone wall to support the roof, was the final heavy lift of the day. The carpenters used the treadwheel crane one last time to hoist these timbers. They bedded the wood into a thick layer of moss and tallow, a traditional barrier designed to prevent the moisture of the stone from rotting the oak. This was the handshake between the two primary trades, where the stone's permanence met the wood's flexibility. As the smiths hammered the last lead tacks into place, the sound was muffled compared to the sharp ring of the morning's chisels. It was a dull, rhythmic thud-thud that signaled the enclosure of space. For the first time, there was a dry spot within the gatehouse, a small chamber where a guard could stand without the sky falling on his head. The castle was no longer just a wall, it was beginning to create an interior, a sanctuary carved out of the windswept ridge. The fire in the lead casting pit was allowed to die down to a glowing amber. The smiths, their faces smeared with soot and their hands stained metallic gray, descended the ladders. They looked back at the turrets, which now wore their leaden caps like helmets. The fortress was prepared for the night, its new skin ready to repel the dew and the frost that would soon settle over the Wolf's Crag. As the purple twilight deepened, the heaviest work of the day shifted to the base of the gatehouse. While the heights were being capped in lead, the gate hangers, a specialized team of master carpenters and heavy-duty smiths, began the installation of the main entrance. A castle without a gate was merely a trap, and the Wolf's Crag required a portal that could withstand both the battering of a ram and the silent rot of time. The gates were not made of single planks but were massive, multi-layered sandwiches of seasoned hard oak. 2 layers of vertical beams were backed by a third layer of horizontal timbers, creating a cross-grain grid that was nearly impossible to split. These doors were 6 inches thick and smelled of linseed oil and old forest. The smiths had spent weeks preparing the clench nails, hand-forged iron spikes with square heads. Now, in the flickering light of torches, the workers hammered these spikes through all 3 layers of oak, turning the points over on the inside to clench the wood into a single, indestructible slab. The most critical components were the hinge pintles. These were massive iron hooks, as thick as a man's wrist, that had been deeply embedded into the stone jambs of the gateway during the morning's masonry work. The gates did not swing on flimsy hardware, they rotated on pivots capped with bronze to prevent the iron from seizing. The lowering of the gate was a moment of immense physical risk. Using a system of pulleys and lever bars, the men groaned as they eased the half-ton valves of wood and iron onto their pins. Once the gates were hung, the bar hole was tested. This was a deep, square tunnel carved 5 feet into the solid masonry of the wall. Inside it sat a drawing bar, a bulk of oak so heavy it required 2 men to slide it. When the gates were closed, this bar was pulled across the back of the doors and locked into a corresponding socket on the opposite side. This transformed the wooden gate into a structural extension of the stone wall itself. The sound of the bar sliding home, a deep, resonant thud, was the first time the castle truly felt like a fortress. To protect the wood from fire, the smiths began the plating. They nailed overlapping scales of iron across the exterior face of the oak. This gave the gate the appearance of a great metallic beast. Every nail head was a boss, a raised iron dome that would deflect the head of an axe or the point of a spear. Between the iron and the wood, they squeezed a layer of raw wool soaked in vinegar, a traditional medieval fire retardant that would keep the wood from igniting if the enemy attempted to burn the gate. The master smith then fitted the wicket gate, a small, man-sized door cut into one of the larger leaves. This allowed for the passage of individuals without compromising the security of the main entrance. The wicket had its own separate locks and Judas hole, a tiny iron-grated window through which the porter could inspect visitors. As the iron hinges of the wicket were greased with pig fat, the squeal of the metal was silenced, replaced by a smooth, heavy glide that spoke of perfect balance. The gatehouse was now a functional mouth, capable of opening to welcome allies or snapping shut to defy the world. The laborers looked at the ironclad barrier with a sense of grim satisfaction. The ridge was no longer open, the path was blocked by 3 tons of oak and iron, held in the unyielding grip of the mountain stone. Deep within the hollow shell of the north tower, the air was cool, stagnant, and tasted of stone dust. While the gatehouse below was being armored in iron, the spiral setters were engaged in a task of claustrophobic precision. They were building the great screw, the stone spiral staircase that would allow defenders to rush from the guardrooms to the battlements. In a medieval castle, the staircase was not just a convenience, it was a tactical weapon, and its construction was governed by the law of the right-handed sword. The masons worked by the light of tallow candles stuck directly to the damp masonry. Each step, which had been meticulously carved earlier in the day, was now ready to be bedded. The central pillar, or the newel, was formed by the rounded ends of these steps stacking perfectly one upon the other. The setters used a specialized plumb rule to ensure the newel remained perfectly vertical. If the pillar leaned by even a fraction of an inch, the circular centrifugal force of the staircase would eventually tear the tower apart from the inside. As each step was laid, it was set into a bed of thin-set mortar, a mixture of lime and sieved sand that acted more like glue than stone paste. The outer edge of the step was keyed into a channel in the tower's inner wall. This meant the staircase was structurally independent, even if the central pillar were somehow shattered, the steps would remain wedged into the outer wall like the teeth of a giant gear. The men moved with a rhythmic, silent efficiency, lifting the heavy stones into the tightening circle of the tower. The most ingenious feature of this construction was the direction of the climb. Every step was laid to turn clockwise as it rose. This was the defender's advantage. In the narrow confines of the spiral, an attacker coming up the stairs would have their sword arm, the right arm, constantly blocked by the central newel. Conversely, a defender coming down the stairs would have the wide part of the step and the open space of the curve to swing their weapon freely. The very geometry of the stone was designed to kill. The treadmasters checked the height of every riser. Unlike modern stairs, medieval castle steps were often intentionally stumble-cut. They would make several steps of exactly the same height, then place one that was slightly taller or shorter. The inhabitants, moving through the tower daily, would develop muscle memory for these irregularities, but a charging enemy in the dark would trip, losing their momentum and their life. The staircase was a trap laid in limestone, a psychological obstacle built into the very bones of the tower. As the last step for the day was notched into place, the masons began the pointing. They used small, pointed trowels to finish the joints between the steps with a hard, white mortar, smoothing the transition so that no toe could catch on a raw edge. The staircase now spiraled upward into the darkness like a stone DNA strand. It felt cold to the touch, solid as the mountain itself, and as the candles flickered out, the silence of the stone took over. The tower was no longer a hollow chimney, it was a ladder to the sky. As the last traces of the sun vanished, leaving the sky a deep, bruised indigo, a team of high-altitude carpenters known as the hoarding builders began their work on the exterior of the battlements. While the stone walls provided immense protection, they had one fatal flaw, a blind spot at the very base of the wall. To see an enemy mining the foundations or placing a ladder, a defender had to lean precariously over the edge. The solution was the hoarding, a massive, covered wooden gallery that projected out over the abyss like a hanging cliff. These structures were prefabricated on the ground, but their assembly in the dark was a feat of nerves and balance. The carpenters used putlog holes, square gaps intentionally left in the masonry by the masons earlier that day. Into these holes, they slid thick oak beams called cantilevers. These beams jutted out 5 feet from the face of the stone, suspended hundreds of feet above the valley floor. The carpenters, tethered only by thin hemp ropes, crawled out onto these beams to lash the floorboards into place. The hoarding was essentially a wooden fortress grafted onto the stone one. It consisted of a floor, a front wall with its own arrow slits, and a sloped roof to deflect projectiles. The most important feature, however, were the murder holes in the floor. These were gaps between the planks that allowed defenders to drop stones, boiling water, or incendiaries directly onto anyone standing at the base of the wall. The sound of hammers echoed strangely in the night air, a sharp, rhythmic wood-on-wood thwack that signaled the castle was extending its reach. To protect this wooden skin from fire, the workers began pargeting the exterior. They applied a thick coating of lime plaster mixed with hair and vinegar over the oak planks. Once dry, this would act as a fire-resistant shield. In the torchlight, the white plaster made the overhanging galleries look like ghostly clouds clinging to the dark stone of the towers. It was a strange marriage of materials, the heavy, eternal permanence of the limestone supporting the light, aggressive temporary nature of the oak. The master carpenter walked the length of the new gallery, jumping heavily on the boards to test their spring. The hoarding had to be flexible enough to absorb the shock of a heavy rock from a trebuchet, but stiff enough to support the weight of 10 armored men. He checked the wedges, small blocks of wood driven into the putlog holes to lock the cantilevers in place. If these wedges slipped, the entire gallery, along with its defenders, would plummet into the darkness below. By the time the moon rose, the hoarding was complete. It cast a jagged, intimidating shadow down the face of the curtain wall, breaking up the smooth lines of the masonry. The castle now looked larger, more predatory. It no longer just sat on the ridge, it loomed over it, its wooden teeth bared. The laborers descended the long ladders, their hands splintered and raw, leaving the high galleries to the wind and the owls. While the exterior of the castle was a display of jagged wood and defensive angles, the heart of the keep held a different kind of challenge. Deep within the central block, the vault closers were assembling the stone ribs of the chapel ceiling. This was the pinnacle of medieval engineering, the point where the crushing weight of the fortress had to be channeled into elegant, soaring lines of prayer. If the hoarding was the castle's teeth, the vault was its soul. The task involved rib vaulting, a revolutionary technique that moved away from heavy, solid stone ceilings toward a lighter, skeletal frame. The masons began by erecting, centering, for the diagonal ribs. These were arched wooden cradles that intersected at the exact center of the room. The precision required was terrifying. The four corners of the chapel had to be perfectly level, or the thrust of the ceiling would push the walls outward, causing the entire tower to burst like an overripe fruit. The stones for the ribs, known as mullion blocks, were carved with deep, aesthetic grooves that served a dual purpose. They reduced the weight of the stone while creating channels that drew the eye toward heaven. The masons bedded these blocks starting from the springers, the stones where the arch first leaves the vertical wall. As they climbed higher, they used staybars of iron to keep the ribs from shifting. The air in the chapel was cool and smelled of wet lime and the iron scent of the tools. The climax of the work was the placement of the boss stone. This was a massive, circular block that acted as the junction point for all the intersecting ribs. It was often the most beautiful stone in the castle, carved with a blooming rose or a snarling lion. As the treadwheel crane lowered the boss into the center of the wooden skeleton, the masons used lead shims to fine-tune its position. Once the boss was wedged into place, the ribs were no longer separate arches, they became a single, interlocking web of tension and compression. With the ribs secure, the webbing began. This involved filling the triangular spaces between the stone ribs with tufa, a lightweight, porous volcanic stone, or thin bricks. This was the skin of the ceiling. The laborers stood on high platforms, reaching above their heads to plaster the webbing stones into place. They worked from the bottom up, the stones held in place by the curve of the ribs and the strength of the fast-setting mortar. By the time the work was done, the chapel had been transformed. The flat, oppressive weight of the stone above had been redirected. The vault acted like a stone parachute, catching the weight of the floors above and funneling it down through the ribs into the thick corner buttresses. The master mason stood on the dusty floor, looking up. In the flickering torchlight, the ribs looked like the underside of a great stone leaf. The ceiling didn't feel like it was pressing down, it felt like it was lifting the room toward the stars. The wooden centering remained in place for now, it would take weeks for the mortar to fully cure, but the stone logic was complete. The chapel was a sanctuary of geometry, a silent hollow in the center of a mountain of war, proving that even a fortress built for blood required the delicate balance of light and line. High above the valley, where the wind whipped with a fierce, chilling edge, the crenelators were crowning the castle. If the walls were the body and the gatehouse the mouth, the crenellations, the familiar gap-toothed silhouette of the battlements, were the castle's armor and its spear. As the night deepened, these master masons worked by the silver light of a rising moon, finalizing the jagged line where the stone finally met the stars. The battlements consisted of two main parts, the merlons, the solid upright blocks, and the crenels, the open gaps between them. This was the battledore of the fortress, designed to give a defender the maximum amount of cover while allowing them a wide arc to return fire. Each merlon was a massive, rectangular tooth of limestone, nearly 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. They were not merely placed on top of the wall, they were keyed into the masonry below with deep iron dowels to ensure that a direct hit from a catapult would not send the entire block tumbling onto the defenders behind it. The masons were currently carving the embrasures, small, secondary openings within the solid merlons themselves. These were often shaped like crosses, allowing a crossbowman to aim his weapon while remaining almost entirely shielded by 3 feet of solid stone. The edges of these crosses were beveled or chamfered, smoothed down at an angle to prevent an incoming arrow from catching a sharp corner and ricocheting into the soldier's face. Every angle was a calculation of survival. Near the center of the curtain wall, the coping stone specialists were laying the final layer. The tops of the merlons were not flat, they were carved with a weathering slope, a gentle pitch designed to shed rainwater outward. Without this slope, water would sit on the flat stone, seep into the joints, and freeze during the winter. The expansion of the ice would act like a slow-motion explosion, cracking the mortar and eventually toppling the battlements. The masons checked the pitch with a spirit level, a simple wooden triangle with a weighted string, ensuring that not a single drop of water would linger on the castle's crown. At the corners of the towers, the work was even more complex. Here, the masons were constructing machicolations, stone openings that projected out over the wall, supported by corbels, stepped stone brackets. These allowed the defenders to drop heavy objects through the floor of the battlements while remaining behind the safety of the merlons. The corbels were massive, deep-set stones that reached 4 feet back into the main wall, using the weight of the entire tower to counterbalance the weight of the overhanging gallery. The sound at this height was a lonely, rhythmic scraping of stone on stone, punctuated by the whistle of the wind through the newly formed crenels. The workers moved with the cautious grace of mountain goats, their world reduced to the few square feet of the wall walk. Below them, the world was a dark, bottomless void, above them, the infinite sky. They were the last men to leave the heights, ensuring that the Wolf's Crag now possessed its final, definitive shape. The silhouette of the castle was now complete, a jagged, man-made ridge that mirrored the peaks of the surrounding mountains. The final act of the day's construction reached the very tips of the towers, the summit points. While the masons finished the stone teeth of the battlements, the flag setters and master smith ascended the narrowest wooden ladders to install the castle's highest features, the iron weather vanes and the great heraldic banners. These were not merely decorations, they were the castle's voice, signaling its allegiance and its defiance to anyone watching from the valley floor miles away. The weather vanes were marvels of the blacksmith's forge. Each was a sheet of hammered iron, shaped like a dragon or a charging knight, balanced on a vertical spindle with surgical precision. To ensure the vane would turn with even the slightest breath of wind, the smith used a bearing of hardened steel lubricated with rendered suet. The spindle was driven deep into the capstone of the turret, secured with molten lead that hissed as it contacted the cold stone. As the wind caught the iron silhouettes, they swung with a mournful, metallic creak, a sound that would become the constant background music of the castle for decades. Next came the banner staves. These were long, straight poles made of mountain larch, a wood chosen for its incredible strength-to-weight ratio and its resistance to the snapping force of high-altitude gales. The poles were banded with iron hoops to prevent the wood from splintering. At the base of each staff, a heavy iron shoe was bolted into the masonry of the wall walk. The flag setters hauled the heavy silk banners up the lines. These flags were massive, large enough to wrap a horse, and dyed in deep crimsons and ochres that looked black in the moonlight. As the first banner was unfurled, it didn't merely drop, it snapped open with a sound like a whip crack. The wind at this height was a physical weight, and the tension on the larch poles was immense. The workers watched as the fabric rippled, the heraldic lions seemingly coming to life in the darkness. These flags served as a visual lighthouse for the Lord's messengers and a warning to his enemies. To see the banner flying was to know the castle was alive and occupied. The final task for this team was the installation of the beacon baskets. These were iron cages mounted on the highest point of the watchtower, filled with dry pine knots and pitch. In an age before telegraphs, these baskets were the castle's lightning. A fire lit in this basket could be seen by the next fortress in the chain, 30 miles away, within minutes. The workers ensured the baskets were angled away from the wooden hoarding to prevent stray sparks from igniting the galleries. The moon was now at its zenith, casting a cold, silver light over the entire ridge. The master mason stood on the highest merlon, his hand resting on the vibration of the flagstaff. He could feel the castle breathing, the hum of the wind through the crenels, the creak of the weather vanes, the distant thud of the gate bar. The Wolf's Crag was no longer a silent mountain. It was now a crowned entity, its iron and silk headers reaching out into the night sky, claiming the very air as its territory. While the banners snapped in the high winds, the cellar diggers were descending into a world of absolute silence and bone-chilling cold. A castle's survival depended as much on what lay beneath the ground as what stood above it. These subterranean vaults were the fortress's stomach, designed to hold the salt beef, grain, and tunnels of ale required to sustain hundreds of souls through a winter of snow or a summer of siege. The diggers worked by the dim, smoky light of oil lamps, their picks striking the deep limestone roots of the mountain. Unlike the airy halls above, the cellars were carved directly into the living rock. This provided a natural, constant temperature that acted as a primitive refrigerator. The walls here were not dressed in fine ashlar, they were rough-hewn and massive, the marks of the heavy picks still visible like the scales of a great beast. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the sharp, mineral tang of freshly broken stone. The architectural challenge of the cellars was load-bearing. Every square inch of the ceiling had to support the staggering weight of the entire keep pressing down from above. To manage this, the masons constructed short stump columns, thick, squat pillars of stone that looked more like tree trunks than architectural features. These pillars didn't have decorative capitals, they transitioned directly into heavy, rounded, barrel vaults. These vaults acted as stone ribs, distributing the vertical pressure of the towers into the surrounding bedrock. Ventilation was the secret to these deep spaces. Without a constant flow of air, the humidity from the earth would cause the grain to rot and the wooden barrels to disintegrate. The masons had spent the day carving air scoops, narrow, angled shafts that traveled upward through 40 feet of solid masonry to reach the exterior wall of the inner ward. These shafts were designed with a trap bend to prevent rain from entering, but they allowed the cool night air to circulate, keeping the atmosphere dry and sharp. In the furthest corner of the lowest level, the ice pitter was finalizing a deep, circular shaft. During the winter, this pit would be filled with snow and packed with straw, creating a frozen core that could last well into July. The stone lining of the pit was bedded in a layer of charcoal and ash, which acted as an early form of insulation. Every stone had to be perfectly flush, a single gap would allow the precious cold to leak into the surrounding earth. As the diggers hauled the last baskets of debris up the narrow service stairs, the cellars took on a tomb-like stillness. The heavy oak doors to the storage rooms were swung shut, their iron hinges groaning in the damp air. Above, the castle was a place of wind and light, but down here, in the dark foundations, the mountain had been hollowed out to serve as a silent, cold guardian of the castle's lifeblood. The Wolf's Crag was now rooted deep, its stone fingers gripping the very heart of the ridge. As the deep chill of the night settled over the ridge, the kitchen founders focused their labor on the castle's most vital domestic engine, the great hearth. This was no ordinary fireplace, it was a cavernous stone stage where the energy for the entire garrison would be forged. Located in a separate wing to minimize the risk of fire spreading to the keep, the kitchen was dominated by a chimney stack so wide a man could stand inside it and look directly up at the stars. The masons began by laying the hearthstone, a singular, massive slab of igneous rock, usually granite or basalt, chosen for its ability to withstand extreme heat without cracking or exploding. Unlike the limestone used for the walls, which could calcine and turn to powder if exposed to constant flame, the hearthstone was a silent, heat-resistant titan. Around this base, they constructed the fireback, a curved wall of firebricks bedded in a mortar of clay and crushed tile, designed to reflect the heat forward into the room rather than letting it soak into the masonry. The architectural centerpiece was the mantel arch. This was a broad, low-slung arch that spanned the 10-foot width of the fireplace. To support the immense weight of the chimney breast above, the masons used joggled voussoirs, stones cut with interlocking Z shapes. This prevented the stones from sliding past one another under the stress of thermal expansion. As the heat rose and fell, the stone would breathe, but the interlocking teeth ensured the arch remained a solid, unbreakable unit. Suspended across the maw of the hearth was the great spit bar. The blacksmiths arrived with a forged iron rod as thick as a spear, resting it on andirons, fire dogs, that had been bolted directly into the stone. Beside the main fire, the pastry masons were finishing the ovens. These were dome-shaped chambers built of thin, flat stones. The secret was the heat soak, a layer of sand and broken glass packed between the inner oven and the outer stone wall. This layer acted as a thermal battery, holding the heat of the fire for hours after the embers had died, allowing for the slow baking of the heavy rye loaves that fed the workers. Ventilation here was as much about safety as it was about smoke. The smoke hood was designed with a tapered internal throat that created a natural draft, pulling the acrid fumes of burning fat and wood upward with a fierce intensity. The masons carved corbels into the interior of the chimney to allow for the hanging of salt pork and hams, using the rising smoke as a preservative. As the hearth workers finished, they lit a small, curing fire of green wood. The thick, white smoke swirled up the new chimney, testing the draft and seasoning the fresh mortar. The kitchen, once a cold shell of stone, began to radiate its first warmth. The scent of wood smoke, the crackle of the curing fire, and the solid, heat-retaining mass of the stone marked the transformation of the fortress into a home. The Wolf's Crag now had a heart of fire to match its skin of stone. As the moon climbed toward its zenith, casting a silver sheen over the jagged battlements, the Avery masters began their specialized work on the mews. In the medieval hierarchy, hunting hawks were as precious as war horses, and their housing required a delicate balance of stone strength and airy ventilation. These chambers were built high on the sheltered, leeward side of the east tower, where the birds could remain safe from the damp valley mists while staying attuned to the rhythms of the sky. The construction of the mews was a lesson in specialized masonry. Unlike the barracks or the cellars, the floors here were not made of heavy slabs. Instead, they were cambered, sloped gently toward a central drainage channel. This allowed the keepers to wash the stone floors daily with water and vinegar, preventing the buildup of mutes, hawk droppings, that could rot the limestone or sicken the birds. The stone was not polished smooth but left with a slight tooth or texture, giving the raptor's talons a secure grip when they were allowed to floor walk. The most critical features were the perch sockets. The masons carved deep, circular indentations into the walls to receive the heavy oak beams that would serve as the birds' resting places. These sockets were lined with lead sleeves to prevent moisture from the stone from rotting the wood. Between the sockets, the masons installed weather louvers. These were thin slabs of slate set at an angle into the windows. They were designed to let in the fresh mountain air and the natural light necessary for the birds' molting cycles, while blocking the freezing wind and driving rain. The master mason himself supervised the perching stone. This was a single, cantilevered slab that jutted out from the tower's exterior, protected by a small stone awning. It was here that the hawks would be weathered, placed out in the open air to sharpen their senses. The stone had to be perfectly balanced. If it vibrated in the wind, it would stress the high-strung birds. The masons used heavy iron dogs to pin this stone deep into the tower's core, ensuring it was as stable as the mountain itself. In the center of the room, a large stone basin was carved out of a single block of marble-like limestone. This was the boking pool, where the hawks would bathe. The interior of the basin was smoothed until it felt like silk, ensuring the birds wouldn't damage their feathers against the stone. A small, hidden lead pipe, a marvel of the castle's internal plumbing, fed the basin from the rainwater cisterns above, allowing for a constant supply of fresh water. As the Avery masters finished their work, the room felt different from the rest of the fortress. It was light, airy, and smelled of cedar and clean stone. The mews represented the castle's connection to the wild world surrounding it. The Wolf's Crag was now prepared to house the lords of the air, its stone walls providing a sanctuary for the very creatures that symbolized the noble hunt. As the night air grew heavy with the scent of approaching rain, the cistern rites began the final assembly of the castle's life support system. On the high ridge of the Wolf's Crag, a well alone was not enough to guarantee survival during a prolonged siege. The castle needed to capture every drop of water that fell from the heavens. To do this, the builders had designed a massive subterranean reservoir, a stone-lined cathedral of water hidden beneath the floor of the inner ward. The construction of the cistern was a feat of waterproofing that predated modern chemistry. The basin was excavated into the bedrock, but the stone itself was too porous to hold water indefinitely. The rites began by tanking the walls with a thick layer of puddle clay, a mixture of raw clay and river sand that had been trampled by oxen until it was as dense and impermeable as rubber. This clay liner acted as a flexible seal, able to shift slightly as the castle's weight settled without cracking. Over this clay, the masons laid a secondary wall of clinker bricks, which were fired at extremely high temperatures until they became glass-like and non-absorbent. The mortar used here was a special, hydraulic, blend, mixed with crushed terracotta and ash, which possessed the unique ability to harden even when submerged. The floor of the cistern was sloped toward a sump hole, a deep depression where sediment would collect, allowing the main body of water to remain clear. The most ingenious part of the system was the filter box. Before the water from the castle's rooftops and gutters reached the cistern, it passed through a series of stone chambers filled with layers of charcoal, fine sand, and coarse gravel. These natural filters stripped away the soot from the chimneys and the dust from the battlements. The masons carved the entry stones with intricate baffles to slow the rush of water during a storm, preventing the sediment in the filters from being stirred up and washed into the main reservoir. The interior of the cistern was lined with sheets of cast lead, their seams burned together with a hot iron to create a seamless, silver-gray skin. This prevented the water from tasting of the lime mortar and ensured that the Wolf's Crag would have a reserve of thousands of gallons of sweet, cool water. The ceiling of the cistern was a series of low, heavy arches, designed to support the weight of the courtyard above where knights would eventually train and horses would gallop. As the first few drops of a midnight drizzle began to patter against the stone, the Wrights finished the inlet grates. These were heavy bronze screens designed to keep out leaves and vermin. The sound of the water began, a hollow, echoing drip-drop that resonated through the stone chambers. The castle was now drinking. The Wolf's Crag had been turned into a giant funnel, its every roof and battlewalk designed to channel the life-giving rain into the darkness of its heart. In the shadow of the inner curtain wall, as the midnight rain turned the yard into a slick of mud and stone dust, the stable masters were finalizing the quarters for the castle's most expensive and temperamental assets, the great warhorses, or destriers. A knight's horse was a weapon of war, and its health depended on the dry-foot logic of the stable's construction. The floor was the masterpiece of this section. Unlike the smooth ashlar of the chapel, the stable floor was laid with cobbles, rough-hewn blocks of granite set on edge. Granite was chosen for its extreme hardness. The constant pounding of iron-shod hooves would pulverize limestone over time, but granite remained unyielding. The masons laid these stones in a herringbone pattern, creating a natural texture that provided the horses with maximum traction, even when the floor was wet. Each stall was a marvel of heavy-duty carpentry and masonry. The stall posts were massive oak beams, charred at the base and set into deep stone sockets to prevent rot. The partitions between the horses were made of thick elm planks. Elm was preferred because it was resistant to the kicks of a startled stallion. The masons carved the mangers directly into the thickness of the wall. These were long stone troughs, polished smooth so that grain wouldn't get trapped in crevices and mold. Above the mangers, they installed hay racks made of forged iron bars, allowing the horses to pull down dry fodder without trampling it into the bedding. The secret to a healthy stable was the slant. The entire floor was built with a subtle, 3-degree slope leading toward a central gutter. This ensured that urine and wash water would immediately drain away, preventing the buildup of ammonia fumes that could ruin a horse's lungs. The gutter led to an external muck hole, a stone-lined aperture in the curtain wall that allowed the stable hands to shovel waste directly into pits outside the fortress. Ventilation was handled by highlights, small, unglazed windows placed near the ceiling. These were designed to pull out the rising heat of the horses' bodies while keeping the ground-level air still and draft-free. The masons carved shutter grooves into the stone, allowing for wooden boards to be slid into place during the winter to seal out the mountain's frost. As the smiths hammered the last iron tethering rings into the walls, the space began to feel complete. The scent of fresh oak, damp granite, and the lingering smell of the forge created an atmosphere of heavy, functional strength. The Wolf's Crag was now ready to house the cavalry that would be its iron fist. The horses would stand on stone as solid as the ridge itself, shielded from the elements by the mountain's borrowed strength. Beneath the solar, in a chamber where the walls were thick enough to dampen the loudest thunder, the armory fittings team worked to organize the castle's lethality. The armory was more than a storage room, it was a high-precision warehouse where the lifespan of wood and steel was guarded against the humidity of the mountain. In the flickering torchlight, the masons and smiths collaborated to build the racks of readiness. The spear sleepers were the first to be installed. These were long, horizontal stone ledges carved with a series of deep, semicircular notches. Each notch was designed to hold the shaft of a pike or a partisan, keeping the weapons upright and preventing the wood from warping under its own weight. To ensure the steel heads didn't rust, the masons carved drip channels at the base of the racks, filled with a layer of dry sand and oil-soaked wool. This created a microclimate that wicked moisture away from the iron tips. In the center of the room, the bowmaster supervised the construction of the drying boxes. Unlike the rest of the castle, which was designed to be cool, the bow storage required a constant, gentle warmth to keep the yew wood from becoming brittle or soggy from the mist. The masons built a hypocaust system, a small, secondary floor raised on stone bricks, with a narrow flue connected to the kitchen chimney far below. This allowed a faint, residual heat to permeate the stone floor. Over this, they built vertical cabinets of cedar wood, which naturally repelled the insects that might bore into bowstaves. The quiver hooks were forged by the smiths and driven into the mortar joints. Each hook was shaped like a broad U to hold the leather quivers of clothyard shafts. The smiths used a cold-setting technique, wedging the iron into the stone with thin slivers of lead to prevent the iron from vibrating and loosening over time. Beside these, the shield rails were mounted, long iron bars that allowed the heavy heaters and bucklers to be hung by their guide straps, keeping them off the damp floor and making them easy to grab in a sudden alarm. The most specialized feature was the sharpening trough. This was a long, rectangular basin carved from a particularly abrasive grade of sandstone. It was designed to be filled with water or oil, allowing the men-at-arms to hone the edges of their swords and axes. The stone was set at a specific height, allowing a man to use his full body weight to press the blade against the grit. The sound of steel rasping against the sandstone, a harsh, rhythmic shrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr fitted with their massive iron locks, the chamber felt like a compressed spring, coiled and ready. The wolf's crag now had its teeth and claws organized, protected by stone that was warm to the touch and wood that was as dry as bone. The mountain had not only provided the walls to hide behind but also the perfect environment to keep the weapons of the garrison sharp, dry, and lethal. High above the bustling noise of the kitchens and the iron-scented air of the armory, the solar joiners were finishing the most intimate space of the fortress, the Lord's private chamber. In the brutal world of a stone castle, the solar was designed to be a soft pocket of civilization. Here, the raw, cold limestone was hidden behind layers of masterfully worked timber, turning a defensive cell into a place of warmth and strategy. The joiners began by furring the walls. They hammered wooden plugs into the mortar joints and attached vertical slats of oak. Over this frame, they mounted the wainscoting, panels of rare, quarter-sawn oak carved with the linen fold pattern, which mimicked the elegant folds of draped fabric in solid wood. This was not just for beauty, the air gap between the stone and the wood acted as a vital layer of insulation, trapping the heat from the small corner fireplace and preventing the mountain's dampness from seeping into the tapestries. Near the window, the masons and joiners collaborated on the window seats. These were deep recesses carved directly into the 8-foot-thick walls. The masons smoothed the stone benches, while the joiners fitted them with polished walnut planks. These seats allowed the inhabitants to sit within the thickness of the wall itself, catching the last of the natural light to read or sew. To provide privacy, they installed pierced screens, thin panels of linden wood carved with intricate geometric tracery. These screens allowed air to circulate and light to filter through in dappled patterns, but shielded the room's occupants from the view of anyone on the opposite battlements. The ceiling of the solar was a masterpiece of coffering. Instead of the heavy, exposed beams of the great hall, the joiners created a grid of recessed wooden squares. Each intersection was marked by a pendant, a small, downward-pointing wooden spike carved into the shape of an acorn or a flower. This decorative grid helped to dampen the echoes of the stone, creating a quiet, hushed atmosphere suitable for private counsel or rest. The solar smiths arrived to fit the final touches, the decorative ironwork. The door hinges were not the blunt, heavy bars used for the gates, but butterfly hinges made of polished steel, etched with floral motifs. The fireplace was fitted with a fire basket of wrought iron, standing on legs shaped like eagle talons. Every piece of metal was burnished until it caught the amber glow of the torches, providing a sense of luxury that contrasted sharply with the functional gray of the exterior. As the joiners rubbed the wood with a final coat of beeswax and turpentine, the scent of the forest filled the room, masking the smell of wet lime and horse sweat from the yard below. The solar was now a sanctuary. The wolf's crag had been tamed. Within its invincible stone shell, it now held a heart of polished wood and quiet light, a testament to the fact that even the most formidable warriors required a place of peace. As the first hints of a cold, pre-dawn gray touched the horizon, the chapel colorists ascended the tower. If the solar was the castle's comfort, the chapel was its spiritual armor. For the medieval mind, a stone wall was not truly finished until it was clothed in color. These specialists brought pigments ground from the earth and precious metals beaten into leaf to transform the raw limestone into a celestial vision. The work began with the ceiling. The fresh mortar of the vaulted ceiling was still slightly damp, which was perfect for fresco work. The artists applied a thin, intonaco layer of fine lime plaster. While this was still wet, they applied pigments mixed with water. The chemistry was absolute. As the plaster dried, the color became a structural part of the stone itself, fused forever into the wall. They painted the ceiling a deep, ultramarine, a blue so intense it was worth more than its weight in gold, made from crushed lapis lazuli imported from the Far East. Next came the diapering of the walls. Using wooden stencils, the colorists applied a repeating geometric pattern of red ochre and white lead. This broke up the massive, intimidating surfaces of the masonry, making the small chapel feel infinitely larger and more intricate. The patterns often featured the fleur-de-lis, or the Lord's heraldic sun, grounding the divine space in the reality of the family's lineage. The focus then shifted to the altarpiece, a block of fine-grained stone. The gilders took over here. They applied bowl, a slick, reddish clay, to the areas intended for gold. Then, using a gilder's tip made of badger hair, they lifted incredibly thin sheets of 24-karat gold leaf. The mere breath of a worker could send the gold fluttering away, so the chapel was sealed against drafts. They pressed the gold onto the clay and burnished it with the tooth of a wolf, rubbing until the metal glowed with a mirror-like sheen. The final touch was the limning of the window embrasures. To maximize the meager light of the high mountains, the sills were painted in a brilliant, reflective white made from crushed eggshells and lime. This acted as a natural amplifier, catching the first rays of the sun and bouncing them deep into the nave. On the edges of these sills, they painted marginalia, tiny, whimsical vines and flowers in malachite green and vermilion red, bringing the life of the valley up into the cold heights of the tower. As the morning sun finally broke over the peaks, its light hit the new ultramarine ceiling and the gold leaf altar. The chapel didn't just brighten, it ignited. The Wolf's Crag was no longer just a gray silhouette against the sky. Inside its strongest tower, it now held a jewel box of color, a silent, glowing chamber that promised that even in a fortress built for war, there was a space for the eternal and the beautiful. As the sun finally cleared the jagged peaks of the horizon, the bell hangers gathered at the base of the tallest watchtower. A castle without a bell was a silent giant, unable to warn its lands of fire or celebrate a victory. The great bell was a massive instrument of cast bronze, weighing nearly a ton, and its ascent to the highest belfry was the most dangerous lifting operation of the entire build. The hangars utilized a great treadwheel crane positioned on the battlements. This was a massive wooden wheel, 16 feet in diameter, powered by men walking inside it like hamsters. As they walked, the axle wound a thick hempen cable, soaked in tallow to prevent friction burn, through a series of pulleys and blocks. The bell was encased in a cradle of heavy oak timbers to protect the brittle bronze from striking the stone walls during the climb. The engineering of the belfry was unique. Unlike the solid masonry of the keep, the belfry required acoustic apertures, large, arched openings designed to let the sound waves escape without being muffled. However, these openings weakened the tower's crown. To compensate, the masons installed tension bars of wrought iron, hidden within the mortar, which acted as a stone corset to hold the tower together against the violent vibrations of the tolling bell. Once the bell reached the summit, it was swung into its headstock, a massive beam of seasoned elm. Elm was the only wood tough enough to withstand the shaking torque of a swinging bell without splitting. The pintles, the pins the bell swings on, were set into bronze bushes to ensure a smooth, rhythmic motion. The bell wasn't just hung, it was tuned to the tower. The hangers adjusted the counterweight so that the center of gravity allowed a single man to ring the ton of bronze with a simple pull of a rope. The clappersmith then installed the internal striker. This was a ball of soft iron, designed to be slightly softer than the bell's bronze body. This ensured that over centuries of use, the replaceable clapper would wear down, rather than cracking the irreplaceable bell. As he struck the first test note, a deep, resonant bong shuddered through the very foundations of the ridge. It was a sound that traveled for miles, vibrating in the chests of the laborers and the villagers in the valley below. The Wolf's Crag now had its voice. The bell was the final piece of the castle's sensory array. It could see with its watchtowers, breathe through its louvers, and now, it could speak. The sound marked the official end of the primary construction phase. The mountain had been transformed into a living, breathing, and vocal monument of stone and iron. The final structural hurdle lay at the threshold of the fortress, the drawbridge. While the great oak gates, Part 8, provided a static barrier, the drawbridge was a dynamic piece of military machinery. It was the iron handshake of the castle, a bridge that could be withdrawn like a limb, leaving a yawning chasm between the attacker and the gatehouse. The drawbridge founders began by assembling the leaf, a massive platform of oak beams reinforced with iron straps. The engineering here relied on the gallows frame, a vertical timber structure built into the gatehouse face. Two massive iron chains, each link hand-forged and tested for hidden flaws by the smiths, were attached to the outer edge of the leaf and fed through stone-lined chain holes in the wall. The secret to a functional drawbridge was the counterweight. A bridge this heavy could not be lifted by human muscle alone. Behind the scenes, in a deep pit within the gatehouse floor called the mashik, the builders installed a balance beam system. Huge blocks of lead and stone were attached to the internal ends of the chains. When perfectly calibrated, the weight of the bridge and the weight of the counterblocks were almost equal. This meant a single guard, turning a wooden windlass, a geared winch, could raise the entire structure in seconds. The pivot masons carved the trunnion sockets, the stone gears at the base of the gatehouse where the bridge's main axle sat. These were greased with thick tallow to ensure a silent, smooth rotation. If the axle was off by even a fraction of an inch, the bridge would rack and jam against the stone jambs, rendering the castle vulnerable. As the sun reached its midpoint on the second day, the master smith gave the signal. The windlass groaned, the chains tautened, and the massive oak leaf rose from the lip of the moat. It fit into the rebate, a recessed frame in the stone wall, with a thunderous clap that echoed through the valley. When closed, the bottom of the bridge became a second, outer wall, flush with the masonry. The Wolf's Crag was now officially closed. The path from the world of the valley to the world of the fortress was now a choice, controlled entirely from within. The castle was no longer a building site, it was a functioning, invincible machine of war. Deep beneath the north tower, in a chamber accessible only by a hidden spiral stair, the alchemist's laboratory has been carved. This is the castle's secret brain, a place of science, medicine, and perhaps a bit of forbidden magic. Unlike the rest of the fortress, which is built for war and comfort, this room is built for containment. The masons used slate for the workbenches instead of wood, as slate is impervious to the caustic waters, acids, that the alchemist distills. The walls are lined with athanors, self-feeding furnaces made of thick clay and brick, designed to keep a constant, low heat for months at a time. This is where the alchemist attempts to fix mercury or create Greek fire for the castle's defense. The vermin-proof library. To one side of the lab is the scriptorium. Here, the stone walls were bored with hundreds of small pigeonholes to hold parchment scrolls. To protect these precious records from dampness and rats, the alchemist uses cinnabar dust, mercury sulfide, in the mortar, a toxic barrier that keeps the library pristine. The serpent's vent. Because the alchemist's work often produces poisonous breaths, fumes, the masons constructed the serpent's vent. This is a zigzagging flue that travels through the heart of the tower. The bends in the flue are designed to catch heavy soot and metallic vapors, preventing a telltale plume of colored smoke from giving away the laboratory's location to those outside. The Siege of 1325, the ultimate test. 50 years after the final stone was laid, the Wolf's Crag faced its greatest trial. An army of 5,000 men, equipped with 3 heavy trebuchets, surrounded the ridge. The Hoarding, Part 10. The attackers tried to scale the walls under the cover of darkness. However, the murder holes in the hanging galleries allowed the defenders to pour boiling sand, which worked its way into the joints of the attackers' armor, effectively ending the assault before it reached the battlements. The Cistern, Part 17. The enemy poisoned the valley stream, expecting the castle to surrender within a week. But the 15,000 gallons of rainwater stored in the lead-lined vaults allowed the garrison to hold out for 4 months without thirst. The Joggled Arches, Part 15. A direct hit from a 200-pound stone projectile struck the kitchen chimney. Thanks to the interlocking stones, the structure vibrated but did not collapse, allowing the roaring heart to continue feeding the troops. The siege was lifted when the Great Bell, Part 22, was rung in a specific triple toll pattern, a signal to a relief army 3 valleys away that the enemy's supplies were low. The Wolf's Crag remained unbreached, a triumph of the laborers, masons, and smiths who worked through those 2 legendary days and nights.